Hi, this is Andy from narcolepsypumpkin.com.
There are plenty of explanations of what solid principles are, but I think we can take a little bit more from them than just coding standards. I'm going to do a series on solid principles with a little bit of a twist. I'm going to take a little bit more time to explain how I think you can apply solid principles to more than just coding standards. Episode 1, the single responsibility principle. Simply put, this should be every scope within your application has a single responsibility, i.e. a single reason to change. Now, one of the common questions about this is how granular should you go? And I suppose in this context, what possibly could you apply this principle to outside of coding standards?
How small should a function be? Some people say I take this to an extreme, but I like a function to be either a single pipeline or a single line of code. And ideally, get it to so you can have it as an expression body. That's how I like code to look. Not everybody's cup of tea. Absolutely understand that. 2 lines of code, okay, that's fine, not a problem. 3 lines of code, yeah, okay. 4 lines of code, at a push. 5 lines of code, get to the point now where I'm having a nosebleed, rocking in the corner. Any more than that suggests there's a fear of change around that function. It means that either it's in the middle of some sort of legacy transition, awaiting unit tests or some testing around it so it can be refactored.
So there indeed may be some exceptions to that, where you've got switch statements or things that genuinely are going to take up more than 1 line of code, or 2 or 3 or 4, and that's fine. It's getting to a point where you're comfortable that you've done what you can to make sure that function is doing just one thing.
You might end up with a huge list of things in one class. Start splitting that up into smaller classes that have a much tighter and smaller scope, so they're named properly and it makes it easier to find things.
I.e. we're going for more classes that do less, therefore their responsibility becomes less, their reason to change is less. So we're applying that single responsibility at another level up. So you get your functions as small as possible, you get your classes as small as possible. And the important thing about the functions is their names must be descriptive. Or at least the code under that only has 1 line, ideally, in my opinion, should be really descriptively named. So you shouldn't have to go digging too far before you understand what that code is doing, so you know what its responsibility is. If you want to find out more, obviously you can dig down. So if you separate your code like that, it should make it relatively easy to find a particular area where it's responsible for the thing you're looking for. You can then group those classes together in libraries. So you can gather your classes together that are changing for one reason. So you've kind of got a scope at each level as to what the reason is to change. So then you group your libraries together inside a solution that changes for one reason. Your solution would be part of a repository that only had one reason to change. That repository would then belong to a team that was responsible for one area of your application. This grouping together of things that share the same reason for change or responsibility is basically the common closure principle, which in many ways is the predecessor to the single responsibility principle. And the essence of that common closure principle is that we group things together that have the same reason to change. How does solid principles, and in this case the single responsibility principle, apply to you? You as a developer have one key responsibility, and that's to write clean code that's readable and understandable by both you and your team. It's important that you write code in a way that you can read it when you come back, and that your team are able to read your code without having to refactor it. The worst thing you can have in a team are such divided opinions on code structure and principles that one developer is refactoring code so they can read it, and then another developer is then refactoring that code again so they can read it.
It's just going to be a war of refactoring. Yes, you're spending a lot of time coding and refactoring, but really not doing anything valuable.
You're not going to agree with everybody, and you're certainly not going to have exactly the same styles. What you have to get to is a compromise where there's an acceptance of subtle differences in style, but you all know how to read each other's without having to refactor it to do so. Because the worst thing you can do is spend all your time pulling a load of code in line to refactor it back out again so you can understand what it's doing. The important thing with that is to communicate. Talk to each other. If you've got a problem, go to the person who wrote that code and try and sort of work out what's a better way of doing it. And you need to be also receptive to that yourself. So that's your responsibility to your code and your team. We've looked at single responsibility for you. What's a single responsibility for your team? Well, I would say that is that your team is responsible for releasing code that has no known defects and does no harm. And by that I mean no known defects doesn't mean that you haven't tested it, therefore you don't know of any defects. I mean that you have tested your code to make sure there aren't any defects, and you've done everything you possibly can to make sure there are no known defects. Inevitably there will be some that get through, there'll be some small, but they should be so small that they shouldn't cause a problem. And that's your responsibility as a team to do that, to make sure you're releasing code that's well written, stable, and doesn't have any defects. And above all, doesn't do any harm. If you think about where code is used today, you might be writing a web application, so hey, it doesn't really do anything that's going to cause any issue. But what if a bug means that you give away thousands of pounds worth of produce for free? That has an impact on your company. That will do damage. But it doesn't have to be that black and white. All code will have some detrimental effect if it's written poorly or is released with defects.
And this is where you can apply the single responsibility at the highest possible level.
You have a responsibility to do right by your customer, and that is very much in line to the responsibility of the team releasing software. That you shouldn't be allowing your customer to have a detrimental experience because of poor software quality. Clean code is important. A good attitude to software testing and releasing is essential. Good teamwork and transparency within your team is very important, and working for an organisation that cares about their customers is probably important to most people. That, in my opinion, is how the single responsibility principle applies to your coding standards as well as yourself, your team and your organisation. As I said at the start, I'm doing this as a small series, so the next one will be the open-close principle and how that applies to your coding standards as well as yourself, your team and your organisation. Are you interested in seeing more videos like this one? If so, click on subscribe, click on the bell so you get notifications when I release new material. Also, you can find useful information on my blog, which is cleancraftsman.com.